Okay, here we are with Chapter 1, Section 2, The Ways We Were. Okay, we're going to start with the first human societies. The first human societies were small. There were bands of people, anywhere from approximately 20 to 50 in those groups. Very low population density, and most of that was mainly because of the lack of technology. There's a very slow population growth. About 70,000 years ago, the population dropped actually to about 10,000, which is a very small number. But around 30,000 years ago, it actually grew to 500,000, which is a significant increase. And by about 10,000 years ago, there were approximately 6 million people. Now, these Paleolithic bands were seasonally mobile or nomadic, and they moved in regular patterns to exploit wild animals and plants following that megafauna and flora. And since they moved around, they couldn't actually accumulate their goods and always carry them with them. And so therefore these societies were highly egalitarian, perhaps the most free people in human existence. They did not have specialists, which means they didn't specialize in any particular skill set, and most people had the same skill set. And the relationships between women and men were far more equal than what developed in later societies. For example, rape, wife beating, and even the sexual double standard are really all unknown, especially to the San culture. And they mostly live in monogamous relationships, but divorce was common. James Cook traveled and described the hunting and gathering peoples of Australia as tranquil and even socially equal. But tensions did exist, and these European settlers observed that there was physical competition among Australian males, and wife beating did exist. But some of the Aboriginal myths did explain how men achieved that power over women. And in the San culture, the distribution of meat, even if there was perceived laziness or stinginess, or even a rivalry for women, caused tensions as well. But these Paleolithic societies had clearly defined roles. The men hunted, the women gathered. There were clear rules about the distribution of meat after a kill. And there were even rules about incest and adultery. And some of them, there's widespread violence. There wasn't really a formal state system, so interpersonal violence was common. And the community as a whole might punish a wrongdoer with death. The economy and the environment. Hunting and gathering peoples used to be regarded as primitive and impoverished, but modern studies have actually pointed out that they worked fewer hours, they wanted or needed little. However, their life expectancy was low, approximately about 35 years average. Now, the alteration of the natural environments that these societies did, they deliberately set fires to encourage the growth of certain plants, and that's a pretty advanced survival skill. And the extinction of large animals shortly after humans arrived, that's obviously a major alteration in the natural environment. As well as actually the gradual extinction of other hominids like the Neanderthals in Europe and the Flores man in Indonesia. And some historians even say that these Paleolithic societies or hunting and gathering societies are like the original affluent society. And that's an interesting argument. They required fewer work hours than agriculture. That allowed for more leisure time. And so that being said, these societies had limited needs to be met. But like I said, they did heavily alter their environment. Setting the fires and the hunting obviously had clear impacts on the environment. And even the alteration of the landscape, and especially the extinction of some of those large animals and other hominids. Okay, the realm of the spirit. Now it's difficult for historians to decipher the spiritual world of Paleolithic peoples. There's a significant lack of written sources. Art is subject to interpretation, and the contemporary hunting and gathering peoples may not necessarily reflect the ancient experience. But they did have a rich ceremonial life, usually led by a part-time shaman, and this was a person who was especially skilled at dealing with the spiritual world. There was a frequent use of psychoactive drugs in order to contact those spirits. But there was an apparent variety of beliefs. Some societies were seemingly monotheistic. Others saw several levels of supernatural beings. And some others still believed in an impersonal force running throughout the natural order. And those Venus figurines that you learned about in section 1, some scholars think that Paleolithic religion was strongly feminine, and there was a great goddess as opposed to a god. And like I explained yesterday, a lot of that had to do with the females being the ones that give birth, which is life. And that was, extremely important, especially if you only live an average of about 35 years. But many did not make the sharp distinction between the material and the spiritual world. Their ceremonial space, like I said, it's very difficult to research their spiritual beliefs of these prehistoric people. But there is clear evidence. We looked at some cave paintings, but some are believed to have been, to have been linked or associated with various forms of ritual or even ceremonial activity. And here's an example of one of those Venus figurines. Like I said, some of them might be missing the legs, but as you can see, this one is missing the arms. But there's no face, it's just a head, maybe some type of, it could be hair, or it could be some type of a garment that covers the head. But like I had mentioned, it's very full-figured, thick, maybe even seen to be carrying life. So there was a strong feminine dimension to their spiritual beliefs, and they had a cyclical view of time, especially concerned with the regeneration and the renewal of life. And so that was a heavy influence on religious thought. Okay, settling down, the Great Transition. There's a gradual change as populations grew, climates changed, different peoples began to interact with one another. And the collection of wild grains really started in northeastern Africa around 16,000 years ago. And that's Many historians link that to the end of the last ice age, which ended about 16,000 years ago. And there's evidence that this was followed by a global warming period, and that led to richer and more diverse environment for human societies to develop, which means populations rose and even the beginnings of settlement. Now, settlement led to societal change. There were larger and more complex societies. The storage and accumulation of goods led to inequalities within societies. And the settling down process occurred in many areas, roughly 12,000 to 4,000 years ago. An example is the Jomon culture in Japan, Scandinavia, which is in northeastern Europe, Southeast Asia, North America, and the Middle East. Göbekli Tepe, which is the first temple. This is located in southeastern Turkey. The ceremonial site comprises of 20 circles made up of carved limestone pillars. And it's believed that these hunter-gatherers built this structure and lived here at least part of the year in somewhat settled villages. And this is an excellent example of monumental construction by a hunting and gathering society. Many of those circles are decorated with carvings of animals. And it's a really interesting site. And some of those limestone pillars were extremely heavy. So it's amazing that they were able to construct such a ceremonial site. Okay, the Chumash hunter-gatherers in Southern California developed substantial permanent structures. And they developed a hereditary political system of elites. There's evidence of a market economy, which means there was free trade. However, there were some class distinctions. Now, these settled hunter-gatherer communities, many there was a major turn away from small group nomadic communities. And people really began to focus on those larger villages and those civilizations that developed. But this placed a greater demand on the environment. Settlement allowed for population growth, but these communities needed more food. That's obviously a more intense demand on the environment with the development of agriculture, and that's an increased need, a need to increase the food supply. There we go. I'll get it out. But as agriculture emerged, societies became more complex. As more and more people are banding together and living together in these societies or civilizations developed. And like we talked about, class distinctions happen. With the accumulation of goods, inequality begins to set in. And so what happens are the ones that have power set up some type of government system, an economic system, and even religion plays a major part because they have to find some way in order to stabilize the community. And so that's how they become more complex. Okay, that is the end of section 2, the ways we were. And we will pick up again tomorrow with breakthroughs to agriculture.